She stood at the edge of the Orinoco River, watching oil tankers drift past like ghosts from another era. The Venezuelan economist had spent 2 decades studying what the world called her country's collapse. But as she gazed at the endless flow of crude oil heading to refineries across the globe, she realized that the real collapse was not Venezuela itself. It was the story the world told about it. The narrative is seductive in its simplicity. Venezuela is the cautionary tale of the 21st century. An oil-rich nation that descended into hyperinflation, mass migration, and political chaos. The standard explanation flows like crude oil. Too much socialism, too much populism, too much corruption. A failed state warning the world about the dangers of straying from orthodox economic wisdom. But every simple story, especially about Latin nations, deserves a second look. Because the story of Venezuela's failure says more about how the world reads crisis than about crisis itself. To understand why everything you know about Venezuela is wrong, you must first understand what Venezuela was never supposed to be. In the imagination of development economists and political scientists, Venezuela should have been the Saudi Arabia of the Western Hemisphere. Massive oil reserves, a democratic government, proximity to the world's largest economy. It had all the ingredients for petrostate success, the puzzle that haunts academic conferences and policy papers is not why Venezuela failed. It's why it failed to succeed, like Norway or the Gulf states. But this question reveals the first misunderstanding. It assumes that Venezuela's destiny was written in oil. It assumes that resource abundance creates a natural pathway to prosperity that Venezuelan leaders somehow bungled. This assumption, what scholars call the resource blessing hypothesis, blinds us to a more uncomfortable truth. Oil wealth does not create prosperity. It creates the illusion of prosperity while systematically destroying the foundations of a productive economy. Consider the paradox that no one talks about. Venezuela's oil production peaked in 1970 at 3.7 million barrels per day. For the next 5 decades, as governments of every ideological stripe tried to maximize oil revenues, production steadily declined. Today, Venezuela produces less oil than it did in 1940. This is not a story of recent mismanagement. This is a story of structural decay that preceded Hugo Chavez by decades, predates the Bolivarian Revolution, and exposes the fundamental impossibility of the petrostate model itself. The economist understood this because she had lived through what outsiders call Venezuela's golden age. In the 1970s and 1980s, when oil prices soared and Venezuela became the richest country in Latin America, she watched her father's small manufacturing business slowly suffocate. Not because of socialist policies, those came later, but because of a phenomenon economists called Dutch disease. As oil revenues poured into the economy, the Venezuelan currency appreciated, making imported goods artificially cheap and domestic production unprofitable. Why invest in factories when you could import everything with petrodollars? Why develop agriculture when you could buy food from Miami? This is the cruel irony that the standard narrative misses. Venezuela's economic model was not socialism. It was neoliberalism's dream, a country that relied entirely on commodity exports and imported everything else, a country that dismantled trade barriers and embraced global markets, a country that trusted the magic of comparative advantage to deliver prosperity through oil specialization. Venezuela followed the Washington Consensus before there was a Washington Consensus. But neoliberal economists, like Marxist revolutionaries, prefer their failures to have ideological villains. It is easier to blame Hugo Chavez than to admit that Venezuela's decline began in the 1980s during the presidency of Carlos Andrés Pérez, a free market Democrat who implemented structural adjustment programs with the enthusiasm of a World Bank technocrat. The hyperinflation that the world attributes to socialist money printing actually began in 1989, a decade before Chavez took power, when the government devalued the currency and eliminated price controls as part of an IMF-sponsored stabilization program. The story becomes even more complex when you examine the class dynamics that no one wants to discuss. Venezuela's oil wealth was never democratically distributed. It created a small rentier elite connected to foreign oil companies and international banks who captured most of the petroleum revenues. The vast majority of Venezuelans, including the emerging middle class, lived off the crumbs of the oil economy, subsidized gasoline, imported consumer goods, and public sector employment funded by commodity booms. This is why Hugo Chavez won elections, not because Venezuelans wanted socialism, but because they wanted to control their own resources. The Bolivarian Revolution was, in its essence, a resource nationalism movement that promised to redirect oil revenues from global elites to domestic constituencies. This is an impulse that appears in oil-rich societies across the political spectrum, from Norway's sovereign wealth fund to Alaska's permanent fund dividend. The difference is that Venezuela attempted this redistribution in the context of a global economy designed to extract maximum surplus from petroleum exporters. Here we encounter the second great misunderstanding. The world sees Venezuela as an isolated case of policy failure. But Venezuela's crisis unfolds within a global oil system that systematically prevents producer countries from capturing the full value of their resources. The majors, ExxonMobil, Shell, Chevron, make far more profit from Venezuelan oil than Venezuela itself. The refineries that process Venezuelan crude are located in Texas and Louisiana, where the real value is created. The petrochemical complexes that turn oil into plastics and fertilizers are in Houston and Rotterdam, not in Caracas. When Venezuela attempted to build domestic refining capacity and reduce its dependence on foreign processing, it confronted a global infrastructure designed to maintain the colonial division of labor between producers and processors. Western governments imposed sanctions not because Venezuela threatened democracy, but because it threatened the extractive logic that keeps developing countries as exporters of raw materials. The Economist had witnessed this transformation firsthand. In the early 2000s, her government built new refineries, expanded petrochemical production, and created joint ventures with Chinese and Russian companies to bypass the traditional oil majors. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Venezuela might escape the resource curse by integrating forward into higher value activities. Then came the sanctions, the financial blockade, and the systematic campaign to isolate Venezuela from international markets. This brings us to the most uncomfortable truth about Venezuela's crisis. It is not simply the result of domestic policy failures. It is the product of an international system that punishes countries for attempting to control their own resources. The same pattern appears across the global south. Countries that nationalize their resources, Iran, Russia, Libya, face economic warfare disguised as human rights enforcement. Countries that privatize their resources, Nigeria, Kazakhstan, Iraq, face political instability disguised as market forces. But this systemic analysis does not excuse the genuine failures of Venezuelan governance. The Chavez and Maduro governments made catastrophic errors that amplified the external pressures. They failed to diversify the economy during the commodity boom. They maintained an overvalued exchange rate that encouraged capital flight. They expanded social programs without building the fiscal institutions to sustain them. They allowed corruption to metastasize within the oil bureaucracy. Most critically, they failed to understand that resource nationalism in a financialized global economy requires different strategies than resource nationalism in the 20th century. You cannot simply nationalize the oil wells. You must control the entire value chain, the technology, the logistics, the markets, the finance. Venezuela nationalized production, but remained dependent on foreign refinement, foreign technology, and foreign capital markets. Yet even acknowledging these failures, the scale of Venezuela's crisis cannot be explained by policy mistakes alone. Hyperinflation reached 1,000,000%. GDP contracted by 75%. 7 million people emigrated. These numbers are unprecedented in peacetime. They suggest external shocks as much as internal dysfunction. The smoking gun is the sanctions regime. Starting in 2017, Western governments imposed the most comprehensive economic sanctions in history on a country that had not invaded anyone. They froze Venezuelan assets, blocked oil sales, prohibited new investment, and severed Venezuela from the international financial system. The stated goal was regime change disguised as humanitarian concern. The result was economic devastation that dwarfed the impact of previous policy errors. Oil production collapsed not just because of mismanagement, but because sanctions prevented Venezuela from importing the chemicals, spare parts, and technology needed to maintain aging infrastructure. The currency collapsed not just because of fiscal deficits, but because Venezuela could no longer access international credit markets to finance its debt. This is the true scandal of the Venezuela story. An entire country was subjected to collective punishment to achieve political objectives that had nothing to do with Venezuelan welfare. Millions of people suffered to satisfy Washington's geopolitical priorities and Wall Street's investment preferences. The humanitarian crisis that emerged from this economic warfare was then used to justify the sanctions that caused it. But sanctions, like socialism, do not fully explain Venezuela's resilience. According to the standard narrative, the Venezuelan economy should have collapsed completely by 2019. The government should have fallen, the currency should have disappeared, and the society should have descended into warlordism. None of this happened. Instead, Venezuela adapted. The Economist observed this adaptation with fascination and horror. As the formal economy contracted, an informal economy expanded. As the state lost capacity, communities organized themselves. As the currency became worthless, people created alternative exchange systems. Millions emigrated, but millions more stayed and developed survival strategies that confounded economic theory. This is what economists call informalization, the process by which people create economic relationships outside state and market structures. Street vendors replace shopping malls. Barter networks replace banks. Community kitchens replace restaurants. Remittances from immigrants replace social programs. It is not prosperity, but it is not collapse either. It is a different form of economic organization that emerges when formal institutions fail. Venezuela's informal economy now accounts for more than just 70% of economic activity. This is higher than most African countries, approaching levels seen only in war zones. But unlike war economies, Venezuela's informal sector is not predatory. It is cooperative. People share resources, rotate responsibilities, and develop reciprocal relationships that substitute for missing institutions. The emergence of this parallel economy reveals the third great misunderstanding about Venezuela. The world sees economic informalization as a symptom of state failure. But informalization can also be a form of resistance to extractive institutions. When the formal economy exists primarily to channel resources to global elites, ordinary people may be better off organizing their own economic relationships. This is not an argument for poverty or chaos. It is an argument for understanding how people respond to systemic crisis. Venezuelans did not passively accept economic collapse. They actively reorganized their economic relationships to survive it. This reorganization contains lessons for other societies facing climate crisis, financial instability, and institutional breakdown. The Economist had documented dozens of these innovations: urban farms that replaced imported food, cooperative banks that replaced commercial banks, community radio stations that replaced corporate media. These were not temporary crisis responses. They were permanent institutional innovations that may outlast the crisis that created them. But the world does not want to learn from Venezuelan innovations because acknowledging them would require admitting that the crisis itself was partly artificial. It would require recognizing that sanctions caused more suffering than socialism. It would require accepting that resource nationalism, despite its failures, may be a rational response to global extractive systems. Instead, the world prefers the simple morality tale. Venezuela chose the wrong economic model and paid the price. This narrative allows other countries to avoid confronting their own contradictions. It allows oil consumers to ignore their role in maintaining extractive systems. It allows international investors to present themselves as victims rather than participants in resource extraction. Most importantly, it allows policymakers to treat Venezuela as an exception rather than a warning. If Venezuela's crisis resulted from unique ideological errors, then other countries need only avoid those errors to achieve stability. If Venezuela's crisis resulted from structural contradictions in the global oil system, then the entire system requires fundamental reform. The Economist knew which interpretation was correct because she had studied the pattern across Latin America. Every major oil producer, from Mexico to Colombia to Brazil, had experienced some version of Venezuela's contradictions: boom and bust cycles, currency volatility, deindustrialization, elite capture, political instability. The difference was not the presence or absence of these problems. The difference was the degree of external pressure applied when countries attempted to address them. Countries that cooperated with global extraction networks received support during their crises. Countries that challenged those networks received punishment. This is not a story about market forces or democratic values. It is a story about power relations in a global economy designed to benefit particular actors at the expense of others. Understanding this does not require defending Venezuelan authoritarianism or minimizing Venezuelan suffering. It requires recognizing that Venezuela's crisis exists within a global context that makes certain outcomes more likely than others. Resource-rich, developing countries face structural pressures that limit their policy options regardless of their political systems. The tragedy is that these pressures are intensifying as climate change makes resource extraction more lucrative and more destructive. The world needs rapid decarbonization, but fossil fuel companies need maximum extraction to service their debt obligations. Oil-producing countries like Venezuela are caught between these contradictory pressures, unable to develop alternative economic models without facing external retaliation. This is why Venezuela matters beyond its borders. Its crisis reveals the impossibility of sustainable development within extractive capitalism. Its innovations reveal alternative forms of economic organization that may become necessary as climate crisis intensifies. Its resistance reveals the costs of challenging global power structures and the creativity required to survive that resistance. The Economist understood that Venezuela's real lesson was not about policy choices, but about systemic constraints. Countries cannot simply choose their economic models. They must navigate global pressures that reward certain behaviors and punish others. Venezuela's tragedy is that it attempted to chart an independent course in a world system designed to prevent independence. But Venezuela's hope is that millions of people learn to organize their lives differently when formal institutions failed them. They created new forms of solidarity, new patterns of exchange, new relationships with nature and each other. These innovations will outlast the current crisis and may provide blueprints for other societies facing similar challenges. The world insists on reading Venezuela as a cautionary tale about the dangers of deviating from orthodox economics. But Venezuela, well, it may actually be a preview of the future, a glimpse of how societies will reorganize themselves when global capitalism can no longer deliver the prosperity it promises. The question is not whether other countries will avoid Venezuela's mistakes. The question is whether they will learn from Venezuela's innovations. As The Economist watched the oil tankers disappear into the distance, she realized that Venezuela's greatest export may not be petroleum after all. It may be the knowledge of how to survive when the system breaks down, how to cooperate when institutions fail, and how to imagine alternatives when the old models no longer work. This knowledge cannot be sanctioned, cannot be blockaded, and cannot be extracted. It belongs to the people who created it through their daily struggles to build dignified lives in impossible circumstances. It is Venezuela's gift to a world that desperately needs new ways of living together. The failure was not Venezuela's. The failure was the world's inability to see beyond its own projections and learn from a society that dared to imagine something different.